According to estate attorneys across the United States, roughly 1 in 3 inheritance disputes ends up in court, filed not by creditors, not by strangers, but by family members against each other. Brothers against sisters, children against parents. People who grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, were loved by the same people, tearing each other apart over what those people left behind when they died. 1 in 3. That means right now, while you are listening to this, someone in a city near you is signing paperwork on a property that was never legally theirs to touch. And somewhere nearby, the person that property actually belongs to has no idea it's happening. My name is Marina. I'm 28 years old, and I want to tell you what it feels like to be lying in a hospital bed with an IV in your arm and a drainage tube in your side, 3 days out of emergency surgery, when your phone rings and a 70-year-old woman's voice tells you that strangers are walking through your grandmother's house with a set of keys they bought legally. Legally. I want to tell you what it feels like to try to sit up too fast and feel the incision pull and have to lie back down because your body is not ready, but your mind is already somewhere else entirely. Already in that house. Already at that door. Already trying to understand how something that was supposed to be yours can be taken while you are physically incapable of stopping it. I want to tell you what betrayal feels like when it comes from the one person in your family you never thought to watch out for. But before I get to any of that, I need to take you back. Back to a kitchen table and a woman named Dorothy and a conversation that happened 3 months before everything fell apart. Because that conversation is where this story actually begins. And because without it, nothing that comes after makes any sense. Have you ever trusted someone completely, handed them the full weight of your belief, and gotten devastation in return? Type, "I know that feeling," in the comments right now. And stay with me, because this story goes deeper before it finds the light. I need you to picture something. A small one-bedroom house at the end of a quiet street. Oak trees out front, the kind that have been there so long, their roots have started lifting the sidewalk in 2 places. A covered porch with a wooden swing that creaks when you sit on it, but has never once broken in 30 years. A kitchen that always smelled like coffee and whatever Dorothy had decided to bake that morning, which was usually something with cinnamon, because she said cinnamon made a house feel lived in. That house was the first stable place I ever knew. My parents divorced when I was 4. My mother remarried within 2 years and moved 40 minutes away into a life that had a new husband and eventually new children and not a lot of room in it for the daughter from the first marriage. My father stayed in town, but drinking was more consistent for him than parenting was, and by the time I was 5, the visits had become unpredictable enough that Dorothy, my mother's mother, my grandmother, went to court and got guardianship. Quietly, without drama, without making it a bigger event than it needed to be. She just showed up and handled it the way she handled most things. Practically, completely, without asking anyone for credit. She brought me to that house on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I remember she had made hot chocolate, even though it wasn't cold enough yet for hot chocolate. She set it on the kitchen table in front of me and sat down across from me and said, "You live here now. This is your home." I said, "Okay." She said, "Good." And that was the whole conversation. I grew up in that house. I learned to read in the armchair by the front window. I did homework at the kitchen table. I had a bedroom down the hall with yellow curtains Dorothy had sewn herself from fabric she found at a yard sale because she said yellow was the color of a room that believed in you. I believed in that room. I believed in that house. It was the one constant in a childhood that had very few of them. My brother Aaron was 8 years older than me. He had grown up in the house too, before the divorce, before everything changed, and he had left for his own apartment by the time I arrived. He came around sometimes, holidays, birthdays, the occasional Sunday dinner. Dorothy always set a place for him. She loved him without conditions, the way she loved everything. But she was not blind to what he was. Aaron was the kind of person who showed up when something was available and disappeared when something was required. He could be charming, genuinely charming, when he wanted to be. He knew how to make Dorothy laugh. He knew how to sit at her kitchen table and drink her coffee and make her feel like the visit was a gift he was giving her, rather than something he was getting from her. And she accepted it as a gift, because she was Dorothy, and that was how she moved through the world, generously, without keeping score. But he borrowed money he didn't repay. He promised things he didn't deliver. And he was never, in all the years I knew him, the person you called when something actually needed to be handled. 3 months before Dorothy died, I came to visit her on a Sunday afternoon. She was sitting in her armchair by the window, smaller than she used to be, slower, but still sharp in the way that mattered. She took my hand when I sat down beside her. She held it for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked at me and said, "Marina, sweetheart, this house is yours. I took care of everything. The will is done. The attorney has a copy. Aaron knows." I said, "Grandma, you don't have to talk about this right now." She said, "I know I don't have to. I want to. I want you to know it's settled." She squeezed my hand once. "I want you to know there is one place in this world that is yours, and nobody can take it." I thanked her. I changed the subject because it made me uncomfortable to talk about what came after her. I made her more coffee. We sat by the window and watched the oak trees and talked about other things. I did not know, sitting there that afternoon, that Aaron had been coming around more than usual in the weeks before. That he had been having long conversations with Dorothy that she hadn't mentioned to me. That on at least one of those visits, he had brought someone with him. A man Dorothy didn't know, who had sat at that same kitchen table and spread papers out across it. I did not know any of that yet. I just knew the house was mine. Dorothy had said so. And Dorothy did not say things she didn't mean. Dorothy died on a Wednesday morning in March. She had been declining for about 6 weeks, slowly, then quickly, the way these things tend to go. A neighbor found her. She had passed in her sleep, in her own bed, in her own house. Her doctor said it was peaceful. I have spent a lot of time since then choosing to believe that. The funeral was on Saturday. 30-some people in a small chapel. Neighbors, church friends, a few people I recognized and more that I didn't. Aaron was there. He wore a dark suit and stood near the front and accepted condolences with the practiced ease of someone who had thought about how he would look in this moment. He hugged me once, briefly, and said she was at peace now. I said yes. We did not talk after that. I held it together through the service. I held it together through the reception at a neighbor's house afterward, through the small talk and the casserole dishes, and the people who said she was such a wonderful woman and you must miss her so much. I held it together through the drive home. I made it to my apartment and through the front door and about 15 feet into the hallway before my legs stopped working properly and I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall. and stayed there for a while. That was Saturday. On Sunday, I was not well, but I told myself it was grief. On Sunday night, the pain in my lower right side that I had been half ignoring for 2 days became impossible to ignore. By Monday morning, I knew something was wrong. By Monday afternoon, I was in the emergency room. By Monday evening, a surgeon was explaining to me that my appendix had ruptured and that I was going directly into the operating room and that I should call someone who could be there when I woke up. I called a friend from work because there was no one in my family I could call for something like that. My mother was 40 minutes away and barely in my life. My father was unreliable on his best days. Aaron, I would later understand the specific cruelty of this. Aaron was at that moment already making phone calls he had been preparing to make for weeks. I woke up from surgery on a Tuesday. There were tubes and monitors and a nurse who checked on me every hour and a window that looked out at a parking structure. The pain was managed but present, a steady pulling ache that reminded me every time I shifted that my body had just been through something serious. Aaron called me on Wednesday. I was still in the hospital. His voice was warm, the way it always was when he wanted something, or when he was managing something. He said he was so sorry about everything I was dealing with. He said he was going to take care of the estate paperwork. He said I shouldn't worry about any of it. He would handle the attorney's office, handle the death certificates, handle whatever needed handling. He said, "You just focus on getting better. I've got the rest." I said thank you. I meant it. I was lying in a hospital bed, grieving my grandmother with a surgical drain in my side, and I was genuinely, completely grateful that someone was handling things I could not physically handle. I trusted him. Not because I had good reasons to trust him, not because his history gave me grounds for confidence. I trusted him because I was exhausted and in pain, and the alternative? Trying to manage an estate remotely from a hospital bed while recovering from emergency surgery was unthinkable. And because he was my brother. And because even people who have given you every reason to be cautious are sometimes the only person available. That was my mistake. I need to be honest about that. Not to blame myself, what he did is entirely on him, but because the truth is that I handed him the opening by not asking questions, by not having a backup plan, by assuming that grief and blood obligation would hold him to a line he had already decided to cross. If you have ever found out that someone used your most vulnerable moment to take something from you, type, "I trusted the wrong person," in the comments. You are not alone in that. Not even close. Here is the timeline. I want you to understand how fast it moved, because the speed of it is part of what made it so difficult to fight afterward. Dorothy died on a Wednesday. She was buried on Saturday. On the following Monday, the same day I was admitted to the emergency room, Aaron made his first call to a real estate contact he had been cultivating for at least 3 weeks prior. A man who bought properties quickly, often below market value, no contingencies, fast close. The kind of buyer who exists specifically for situations where someone needs to move a property without much scrutiny. Aaron had found this man before Dorothy was gone. Let that land for a second. He had been preparing this before she was in the ground. While I was sitting in that armchair beside her, while she was telling me the house was mine and everything was settled, he was already working a separate plan. The will was the obstacle. Dorothy had drafted it properly. An attorney's office, 2 witnesses, everything signed and filed. It named me as the sole beneficiary of the house. In the eyes of the law, That document was the only thing standing between Aaron and $43,000. So he challenged it. He filed a legal claim contending that Dorothy had lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid will, that she was confused, that she hadn't understood what she was signing, that someone had influenced her. This is a recognized legal strategy in estate disputes, and it requires a court process that takes time. Time that Aaron did not intend to wait for. This is where the notary came in. The man who certified certain documents in this process had a history. Disciplinary complaints. Nothing that had cost him his license yet, but a pattern that Marina's attorney would later describe in court as a professional record that raises serious questions. He and Aaron had a prior relationship that neither of them volunteered information about. The sale closed 12 days after Dorothy's funeral. 12 days. The buyers were a couple in their early 40s who had been looking for a starter home in that neighborhood for several months. They went through their agent, signed the paperwork, transferred the funds, and received the keys. They had no knowledge of the contested will. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. In the eyes of the law, they were innocent purchasers, which would later complicate everything significantly. Aaron received $43,000. He told me he was managing the estate. He told me the attorney's office needed more time. He told me these things calmly, in a warm voice, over the phone, while I was in a hospital bed and had no way to verify any of it. He spent 4 days after the sale not answering his phone consistently. He said later he had been dealing with some things. He said this with the same practiced ease he used for everything. I did not yet know what he had done. But somewhere in the back of a house, on a quiet street with oak trees out front, a couple I had never met was unpacking boxes into rooms that had held my entire childhood. It was a Sunday morning, 11 days after the funeral, 8 days after my surgery. I was lying in the hospital bed after a dressing change, the kind of tired that lives underneath regular tired. A bone-level exhaustion that pain medication doesn't touch, it just blurs the edges of. My phone was on the table beside me. I had been drifting in and out of a light sleep when it buzzed. The number was Miss Linda's, Dorothy's next-door neighbor for the past 19 years. A woman in her early 70s with silver hair she kept in a neat braid and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and an unshakable habit of noticing everything that happened on that street. She and Dorothy had shared a fence line and a standing arrangement involving a spare key and a watering schedule for whenever either of them traveled. I answered. She said, "Marina, honey, I don't know if you've heard anything, but there are strangers going in and out of Dorothy's house. They have keys. I asked them about it this morning when I saw them on the porch, and they told me they bought it." I did not respond immediately. I heard the words, but my brain processed them the way it processes things when the medication is still working. Slowly, in pieces, like assembling something in the wrong order. I said, "What do you mean they bought it?" She said, "They said they closed about a week and a half ago. Nice couple." Seemed confused about why I was asking. "They showed me the paperwork on their phone, Marina. It looks official." I said, "Miss Linda, that's not possible. The house is in the will. It's mine." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very gently, "Honey, I know what Dorothy told you. She told me the same thing. That's why I'm calling." I thanked her. I told her I would figure it out. I hung up. I lay there for a moment looking at the ceiling. Then I called Aaron. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I called a third time. On the fourth call, he picked up and said, "Hey, sorry, I was in the middle of something. What's up?" I told him what Miss Linda had told me. There was a pause on his end. Not a long one, maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, I felt something shift. The way the air pressure changes before a storm. A stillness that means something is coming. He said, "Okay, look, I can explain that." I said, "Then explain it." He said, "The will had some issues, some legal complications. I had to make some decisions to protect the family's interests. The house was going to get tied up in probate for months, maybe years, and there were costs involved. And I talked to an attorney who said the best move was to liquidate and divide the proceeds." I said, "You sold it." He said, "I handled the situation." I said, "Aaron, you sold Grandma Dorothy's house while I was in surgery, without telling me." He said, "Marina, I was trying to help. You were in the hospital. I was trying to take care of things." His voice was still warm, reasonable. The voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who is overreacting. I had heard that voice my entire life. I knew exactly what it was. I said, "I want to see every document. Everything. I want to see the sale paperwork and the attorney correspondence and every single thing you signed. I want it today." He said he would send it over. He said I should get some rest. He said we could talk more once I was feeling better and thinking more clearly. He sent nothing. I called him twice more that afternoon. Both calls went to voicemail. I sent 3 text messages. He read all 3. The little read receipt appeared under each one, those 2 small words that confirmed he had seen them. And he did not reply. I lay in that hospital bed, and I looked at those read receipts for a long time. And I understood, with the specific clarity that comes when there is nothing left to hope for, that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was not Aaron being careless or impulsive or short-sighted. He had planned this. He had timed it. He had waited for the exact moment when I was the most physically helpless I had ever been in my life. And he had moved with a precision that required weeks of preparation. My grandmother was 11 days in the ground. The house she had promised me, the only stable thing I had ever had, was gone. And I was alone in a hospital bed trying to figure out what came next. I want to ask you something directly. If you found yourself in this situation, betrayed by your own family at the moment you were most vulnerable, would you fight back? Or would it break you? Tell me in the comments. Because what I did next surprised even me. The doctor told me I needed at least another week of bed rest. No sudden movements, no stress, no exertion. He said this in the careful, measured tone that doctors use when they want to be clear without being alarming. He said the body needs time. He said healing is not something you can rush. I got up on day 3. Not recklessly, not dramatically. I sat up slowly. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I breathed through the pull of the incision. And I asked the nurse for my street clothes. She looked at me the way medical professionals look at patients who are about to do something they cannot officially endorse. She said she was going to note in my chart that I was leaving against medical advice. I said I understood. I signed the form. I got dressed in the bathroom, which took twice as long as it normally would have, and I walked out of that hospital on my own 2 feet. I want to be honest about what those first few days looked like. I was not some action hero. I was a 28-year-old woman who had been cut open less than 2 weeks earlier, who winced every time she reached for something above shoulder height, who had to sit down and rest after climbing a single flight of stairs. My body was still in the middle of healing from something serious. I was running on grief and adrenaline and a specific kind of anger that I had never felt before. Clean, cold, focused. The kind that does not make you loud, but makes you very, very precise. The first call I made was to a woman named Carol, who was a paralegal at a firm my coworker had recommended when she went through her own family dispute 2 years earlier. Carol's boss, an estate litigation attorney named Mr. Pearson, agreed to see me the next morning. I took a cab because I wasn't supposed to drive. I sat in his office with my hands in my lap, and I told him everything from the beginning. Dorothy, the will, Aaron's offer to handle the paperwork, the surgery, Miss Linda's call, the Reed receipts. Mr. Pearson listened without interrupting. He took notes in a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The good news is that a will contest requires a court process, and the outcome of that process is not automatic. The bad news is that a sale that has already closed to a good faith buyer is extremely complicated to unwind." He said it was not impossible. He said he had seen harder cases come out right. He said, "I need you to get me everything." I filed the police report that afternoon. The officer who took my statement was professional and not particularly encouraging. He explained that civil fraud and criminal fraud were different categories, that this would likely be handled primarily through civil court, that the criminal side would depend on what the investigation turned up. He said these things kindly, but I could tell he had given this speech before. I thanked him and went home. Aaron called me 2 days later. It was the first time he had reached out since the hospital. His voice had shifted, slightly, but I noticed it. The warmth was still there, but underneath it, there was something more careful now, more managed. He said, "Look, I know you're upset. I should have communicated better about what was happening with the estate. But, Marina, the will had real problems. There was going to be a probate process that could have taken 18 months. Legal fees that would have eaten up a significant portion of the value. I made a judgment call. I was trying to protect both of us." I said, "Aaron, the will named me as the sole beneficiary." He said, "The will was drafted when Grandma was already not herself. Anyone who knew her in those last few months could see she wasn't fully there. I was protecting her wishes." I said, "What exactly does that mean?" He said, "It means I think if she had been clear-headed, she would have wanted the proceeds divided equally between us. We're family, Marina. She would have wanted us taken care of equally." I said, "I'm going to need you to say all of that again." I pressed the record button on my phone. He kept talking. He talked for 11 more minutes. He said the money was already allocated, that he could work out a payment schedule, that he hoped we could handle this like adults without involving more attorneys. He said the word family 7 times. I counted. When we hung up, I sent the recording to Mr. Pearson. He called me back within an hour. He said, "This is useful." He said, "It is not sufficient on its own, but it is useful." He said what we needed now were witnesses, people who could speak to Dorothy's state of mind when she executed the will. And we needed to look more carefully at the notary. He said, "Give me 2 weeks." I said, "Give me the list of everything you need, and I'll start on it tonight. He said, "Marina, you just had surgery." I said, "I know. Give me the list." Here is something people do not always understand about legal fights. The most important moments rarely happen in the courtroom. They happen in parking lots and over kitchen tables and on phone calls that start out as something else entirely. They happen when someone who has been sitting on a piece of information finally decides they have held it long enough. Miss Linda was the first person I called once Mr. Pearson gave me the witness list framework. She answered on the second ring. When I told her I was pursuing legal action to recover the house, she said, "Good. I've been waiting for you to call me back." I drove to her house on a Thursday afternoon, which I should not have been driving to but did anyway, and sat across from her at her kitchen table while she told me what she knew. About 2 weeks before Dorothy died, Aaron had come to the house with a man Miss Linda didn't recognize. Not a neighbor, not anyone from the church, not anyone she had seen before. They arrived in a dark sedan. They went inside, and they were there for about 90 minutes. At some point during those 90 minutes, Miss Linda, who had been weeding her front garden, heard Dorothy's voice through the open window. She wasn't shouting, but Miss Linda could tell she was upset. The way you can tell from the pitch and the rhythm, even when you can't make out the words. Upset and possibly crying. The man left carrying a manila folder. Dorothy came to the window a few minutes later and saw Miss Linda in the garden. They looked at each other. Dorothy raised her hand in a small wave. Miss Linda said she looked tired, not confused, not diminished, just tired, and sad in a way that hadn't been there before that day. I asked Miss Linda if she would be willing to testify to this. She said, "I already told you. I've been waiting for you to call." The second witness Mr. Pearson found was Dorothy's family doctor, a physician named Dr. Reeves, who had been her primary care provider for 11 years. He reviewed his own records and provided a written statement confirming that at her last appointment, 6 weeks before her death, Dorothy had been alert, oriented, and fully competent. She had asked specific, coherent questions about her medications. She had accurately recalled details from their previous appointment 3 months prior. She had been, in his clinical assessment, a woman in possession of all her faculties. The third piece was the notary. Mr. Pearson had a researcher pull the professional history on the notary who had certified the documents Aaron used to challenge the will. What came back was not a criminal record. It was something more quietly damaging. A pattern. 3 prior complaints filed with the state licensing board over a period of 9 years. 2 had resulted in formal reprimands. 1 had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but was still on the public record. In 2 of the 3 cases, the complaints involved the notary certifying documents in circumstances where the signer's competence or consent was later questioned. He had never lost his license, but his record told a story. Mr. Pearson said, "In court, this becomes a pattern of conduct. Combined with your recorded conversation with Aaron and Miss Linda's testimony, we have the foundation of a case." I asked him what our chances were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't make predictions. But I'll tell you this. I've seen weaker cases win and stronger cases lose. And right now, the facts are moving in your direction." I want to pause here for a second, because I've been telling you about documents and testimony and legal strategy, and all of that is true, and all of it mattered. But what I haven't told you is what those 7 months actually felt like from the inside. It felt like being asked to carry something very heavy for a very long distance, with no guarantee that putting it down at the end would be worth it.
It felt like spending every weekend rereading the same documents, looking for something you might have missed. It felt like watching the clock during working hours because every hour billed by Mr. Pearson's office was an hour I would have to pay for somehow. It felt like calling Miss Linda on Tuesday evenings just to talk to someone who remembered Dorothy and could confirm that the house was real and the promise was real, and I was not fighting for something that existed only in my memory. It was exhausting in a way that is very different from physical exhaustion. Physical exhaustion ends when you sleep. This kind followed me into sleep and was waiting when I woke up. But I kept going, because Dorothy had sat in that armchair and told me the house was mine. And I had said, okay. And that, it turned out, was a promise too. Here is a number: $43,000. That is what Aaron received for Dorothy's house. Slightly below market value. The buyer had negotiated, and Aaron had accepted quickly because he needed the transaction to close fast more than he needed to hold out for a better price. $43,000, wired to his account in a single transfer on a Tuesday afternoon in March while I was lying in a hospital bed and had no idea any of it was happening. He spent it in 21 days. Mr. Pearson's financial investigator pieced this together over the course of several weeks, pulling records and following the paper trail that people leave when they spend money quickly and without thinking too carefully about who might be looking later. There were debt payments, some of them legitimate, credit cards, and a personal loan that had been overdue for months. But the amounts didn't fully account for the total, and when the investigator dug further, some of the debt appeared to have been payments to individuals rather than institutions, with no clear documentation of what it was for. There was a renovation on Aaron's apartment. New flooring, a bathroom update, work that had apparently been scheduled and waiting on funds. There was a truck purchased on a credit arrangement that used the cash as a down payment. There was a trip, a week out of state, a resort, the kind of thing you do when you have suddenly come into money you did not have before. By the time the court issued an order freezing his assets, pending the outcome of the civil case, Aaron's bank accounts held less than $4,000. He had, in 21 days, converted $43,000 into a truck with payments, a renovated apartment, and a memory of a vacation. I found out about this from Mr. Pearson on a Thursday morning. He told me in the same measured tone he used for everything, the tone that delivered good news and bad news with equal steadiness, because he had learned, or perhaps been born with, the understanding that the way you deliver information shapes how the person receiving it is able to use it. He said, "The practical implication of this is that even if the court rules in your favor on the house, recovering the cash equivalent from Aaron directly will be difficult. He has significantly reduced his liquidity." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What about the house itself?" He said, "If we can get the sale voided, the buyers would receive their money back from Aaron, which would become a separate civil judgment against him, and you would receive the property. That is the outcome we are working toward." That evening, my mother called. She called from a number I had mostly stopped answering, but that night I picked up. She started gently, asking how I was feeling, how my recovery was going. Then she moved into it. The real reason she was calling, the way someone moves into a cold swimming pool, one careful inch at a time. She said she had spoken to Aaron. She said he felt terrible about everything and that it had been a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. She said he was willing to make it right, that he would pay me back over time, that going through the courts was going to cost more in legal fees than I would ever recover and destroy the family in the process. She said, "Marina,
Dorothy would not have wanted this. She would not have wanted you two tearing each other apart over a house. I listened to all of it. I let her finish. I held the phone and looked out the window of my apartment at the street outside and thought about Dorothy in her armchair, about the yellow curtains, about the swing on the porch that creaked but never broke. Then I said, "No." She said, "Marina." I said, "No. I am not settling. I am not accepting a payment plan. I am going to court, and I am going to get the house back. That is what is happening." She said I was being stubborn. She said I was letting anger make decisions for me. She said a lot of things after that, but I had already made mine. I thanked her for calling. I ended the call. I put the phone down on the table and sat very still for a while. This was the moment. Not the call from Miss Linda, not the red receipts, not even the morning I left the hospital. This was the moment I stopped waiting for someone in my family to stand beside me. They had chosen their position. I had chosen mine. And I understood, sitting in my apartment on a Thursday evening, that I was going to do this alone. And that alone was enough. The case lasted 7 months. 7 months of hearings and continuances and document requests and depositions, and days when Mr. Pearson called with updates, and days when he didn't call at all, and the silence was its own kind of information. 7 months of paying legal bills on a payment plan I had negotiated with his office because I did not have the money to pay them any other way. 7 months of going to work every day and doing my job and coming home and opening the case folder on my laptop and going through it again in case there was something I had missed. I was at every hearing, every single one. Aaron attended roughly half of them. He always arrived with his attorney, a man in a gray suit who had the practiced bearing of someone who had spent decades making his clients seem more reasonable than they were. Aaron dressed carefully for the ones he showed up to. Not too formal, not too casual. The visual language of a man who was cooperating without admitting anything. He never once met my eyes in the courtroom. Not on any of those 7 months. I noticed. The turning point came in month 5, when Dr. Reeves testified. He was a precise and credible witness, calm, specific, not given to editorializing. He described Dorothy's final appointment in detail. He answered the opposing attorney's questions directly and without flinching. When asked whether it was possible that Dorothy had been confused or mentally impaired at the time of the will signing, he said, "Based on my clinical observations during that period, it was not consistent with what I observed. She was not confused. She knew exactly who she was, where she was, and what she owned." Miss Linda's testimony came the following week. She was 72 years old and 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she sat in that witness chair like someone who had been waiting a long time to say what she had to say and was not going to waste the opportunity. She described what she had seen: the man with the folder, the sounds from inside the house, the look on Dorothy's face at the window afterward. She described it precisely, without embellishment, and when Aaron's attorney attempted to suggest she might have been mistaken about what she'd heard through the window, she looked at him with the patient steadiness of someone who has heard a lot of noise in her life and knows exactly when something matters. She said, "I have lived next to that woman for 19 years. I know what her voice sounds like when she is upset." She was upset. Aaron's attorney did not follow up. The ruling came on a Friday morning. Mr. Pearson called me at 9:17. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside my office building because I had not been able to make myself go inside and sit at a desk while I waited. He said, "Marina, we won. The court ruled the sale invalid. The will was legitimate. Dorothy had been mentally competent. The notary had acted improperly, and the challenge Aaron had filed was dismissed. The buyers, who had been named as parties in the proceedings but against whom no wrongdoing was found, would recover their purchase price through a judgment against Aaron. Aaron himself was found to have committed fraud and referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. He would later receive a suspended sentence and a civil judgment that he would be paying off for years, on top of the debt from the truck and the renovations and everything else. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time after Mr. Pearson hung up. I wasn't crying. I wasn't celebrating. I was doing what I imagine people do when something they have been holding their breath for finally resolves. I was just breathing. Slowly. Fully. For what felt like the first time in 7 months. Then I drove to the house. I parked on the street in front of it. The oak trees were there, the same ones, their roots still lifting the sidewalk in the same 2 places. The porch swing was gone. The buyers had replaced it with a bench. But the porch was still there. The covered porch with the same wooden boards underneath. Mr. Pearson had the keys sent to me the following Monday. I drove over that afternoon and stood at the front door. I stood there for a long time. Several minutes. The key was in my hand. My hand was at the door, and I could not make myself turn the key. I don't entirely know how to explain this. I had spent 7 months fighting for the right to stand exactly where I was standing. And now that I was there, I couldn't move. I just stood on the porch of my grandmother's house in the October afternoon light, with the key in my hand, and breathed. Then I unlocked the door and went inside. The house was not the same. I want to be straightforward about that because sometimes stories like this end with a return that feels like restoration. You get the thing back, and the thing is as you left it, and the wound closes cleanly. That is not what happened here. The couple who had lived in the house for the 7 months of the proceedings had not been careless. They had treated the place with basic respect, but they had also made it theirs, the way people do when they believe they are somewhere permanently. Dorothy's armchair was gone. It had been in the living room by the window, and they had replaced it with a sectional sofa that they had taken when they left. The floral wallpaper in the hallway, the paper with the small blue and yellow flowers that Dorothy had put up in the 90s and that I had grown up looking at every day, had been painted over. A flat, neutral beige that had no memory in it at all. The kitchen cabinets had been repainted. The yellow curtains in what had been my childhood bedroom were gone, replaced by something gray and modern and entirely foreign. I walked through every room. I took my time. I let myself feel what there was to feel, which was a mixture of things, relief and grief, and a stubborn, quiet gladness that was underneath both of them. Then I went to the kitchen window. And there, on the windowsill, was a clay pot with a geranium in it. Small, slightly overgrown, the leaves reaching toward the light the way geraniums do when they have been kept alive by someone who knows what they're doing. Dorothy had grown geraniums on that windowsill for as long as I could remember. The pot had been there the day I moved in as a 5-year-old. It had been there through every year of my childhood. When I asked her once why she always kept geraniums, she said, "Because they're stubborn. You neglect them and they come back. You move them and they adjust. They just keep growing wherever you put them." Miss Linda had been keeping the geranium. She had taken it the day the buyers moved in, had knocked on the door, and asked if she could have the plant from the kitchen, saying the previous owner had given it to her. They had said, "Of course." She had tended it for 7 months.
And on the afternoon I got the keys, she had let herself in through the back, she still had Dorothy's spare key, and put it back on the windowsill, where it belonged. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I looked at that geranium for a long time. The months that followed were not simple, and I am not going to pretend they were. Rebuilding a house that strangers have lived in is practical, achievable work. You repaint, you replace, you slowly reacquaint yourself with the space until it starts to feel like yours again. I found Dorothy's armchair at a secondhand furniture shop across town. Not her actual armchair, but one so close in shape and color that when I put it by the front window, it sat there like it had always been there. I put it there on a Saturday afternoon and sat in it and looked out at the oak trees and did not get up for a very long time. Aaron and I have not spoken since the verdict. He sent one text message, 4 weeks after the ruling, that said, "I hope you're okay." I read it and did not respond. That is the full extent of our communication. My mother called several times in the months after. Our relationship is not repaired, but it is not entirely severed either. We speak occasionally. We do not speak about Aaron or the house or the 7 months. We speak about ordinary things, cautiously, like two people crossing a floor that might not hold weight evenly. I don't know what it will become. I know what it is right now, and right now, I can manage it. I want to tell you what I have learned, not the legal lessons. Those are specific and situational, and you should consult an actual attorney. I mean the other things, the things underneath. I learned that vulnerability is not the same as helplessness. I was in a hospital bed when this started. I was grieving and in physical pain and completely dependent on other people in ways I had never been before. And someone used that. Someone looked at the most vulnerable I had ever been and made a calculation. And I want you to hear this clearly. That calculation was about him. It was a reflection of who he is. It was not a reflection of anything about me. I learned that the family you are born into is not the family you are owed. Miss Linda is not my family by blood. Mr. Pearson was hired help. Dr. Reeves was Dorothy's physician who chose to do the right thing because it was the right thing. These are the people who showed up, not the people whose names share a last name with mine. I learned that the house was never really about the house. Dorothy had told me once, sitting in that armchair in the fall light the year before she died, that the reason she had put the house in my name was not about property. She said, "I want you to have one place in the world that no one can take from you. I want you to know what that feels like. Because once you know what that feels like," she said, "you carry it with you. Even when the walls aren't around you anymore, you carry it." She was right. She was right even when the walls were gone and strangers were walking through her kitchen, and I was in a hospital bed with a drain in my side and a brother who wasn't answering the phone. I carried it. I am still carrying it. The geranium on the windowsill is doing fine. It has put out 2 new blooms since I moved back in. Stubborn, Dorothy would have said. You neglect them, and they come back. If this story stayed with you, if you have a person in your life who kept something alive for you while you were in the middle of the hardest stretch of yours, tell them, not tomorrow, today. And if you are in the middle of your own hardest stretch right now, carrying something heavier than you thought you could carry, I want you to hear what Dorothy told me. You carry it, and you keep growing wherever you are put. Type, "I'm still carrying it," in the comments if this reached you.
and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.